Wait,
today, ladies
wait.
and gentlemen, you're not gonna believe.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's perfect now. I think so. But actually,
Oh my god, listen to the packaging.
You would implement it.
This is
$20 a day, it's on around zero.
can someone like check this because I don't want the blame if it's not recorded.
What's the problem?
Can you check
Someone should check it.
just so that I don't have to take the blame?
I mean,
Yeah.
it's just
wait,
a...
does my
Oh, it's
height-
actually been recording the entire time. That's so exciting. Yes, it appears to be
Does
working.
the height work as well?
Kat, can you just stand there?
Yeah, you good.
Surely not. Fuck the Oh yeah, we're chilling. It's fine.
It's not my fault. Yeah, it is recording, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Am I ready? Can I start? Okay. Two big problems with politics at the moment. In the developed world, people cannot actualize their preferences because massive media monopolies and corporate capture convince them to believe things that they would not in any world otherwise believe. Second problem, in the developed world, in nascent democracies, in particularly low trust contexts, people literally just do not trust that the government is actualizing their preferences properly. We'll win in both contexts. Three parts of this speech. Firstly, on setup. Secondly, explaining why people's intuitions and preferences are good and will make good policy. And secondly, explaining why this will make people trust systems more. First of all, a few things in terms of setup. The first thing to say is that we think we're perfectly happy to support our full burden. We think this can apply in literally every single country in the world. Obviously, they would operate in separate systems. Second of all, we think it's fair for us to assume feasibility of this technology. That is like, the device works perfectly. It measures people's preferences perfectly. You can't like get water on it and it stops working. Like, you know, I guess have the debate properly. The third thing is that we think it can reevaluate the person who is in charge in regular election cycles. But obviously, it wouldn't be like a liquid democracy thing where it changes all the time. Fourth thing to explain then is how we think this device is going to measure people's preferences, and we would note two things. The first is that we think that people obviously have a series of very complex preferences, and as we'll explain in a second, that's the reason why they're particularly bad at voting, but often they have contradictory preferences, they have contradictory preferences, and we think the way that the device will evaluate that is that it will take the convictions that are the most deeply held, the most passionately and innately believed in, those sort of like guiding values are the things that the machine will use. And we would suggest that these things, as we'll explain in a second, are fundamentally good. People in general do care about things like fairness, they care about trust, they care about equality. Those are the sort of like intuitions and preferences that the machine is likely to measure. But second of all, we would say this also measures politicians and their ability to deliver policies. So for example, it would match people's intuitions with the actual capacity of politicians to deliver on them. So to the extent that politicians sometimes lie, pitch their policies as different to what they actually are, the machine also reads the politician, sees whether they're lying and sees whether that policy is actually feasible and then matches people. I think that's perfectly reasonable for us to assume. Two arguments then. First of all, people's intuitions and preferences are good. We'll explain two things. The first thing to explain here is that the voting process often diverts people's votes away from their actual interests, and that means that they vote in ways that are particularly bad. A few reasons why this is true. The first is that we think that people can be sort of fed information that's against their intuitions. They're often fed this information, for example, by politicians who obviously have an incentive to be elected and want to pitch their policy in whatever way will get them elected. But second of all, it's by the media who also have political incentives and political interests and want to convince people of things that are actually against their interest, and we know that happens all the time. That, for example, it is quite easy for politicians and the media to collude to, for example, convince poor people that deregulating business will make them wealthier. And those are things that people believe, even though they are against their actual intuitions, their actual preferences for things like wealth, for things like fairness. People are convinced of those things by people who have an incentive to lie. But the second thing to explain is that people cannot typically access information that would convince them otherwise. So there is a level of information asymmetry which convinces people of things that are bad and illogical. And that's for a few reasons. The first is that, as I explained in my introduction, in a lot of countries there is enormous media capture and enormous monopolization that just makes it really easy for particular media conglomerates to get really big, to amass a huge amount of wealth and to feed people an enormous amount of information. Second of all though, we would note that advertising works particularly perniciously to allow politicians to convince people of things. And like, think about if you're the person who lives in like the few regional areas that Clive Palmer funneled pumped like a huge amount of money into, right? Like the majority of the advertising you see is Clive Palmer advertising. You get convinced of things that are bad and it's hard to access information to the contrary. But thirdly, we think often particularly poorer people are locked out of important mechanisms for accessing different kinds of sources of information. So for example, the average person can't afford to pay for like an economist service, subscription service, and like unlock all the highest tiers of all of the different sort of news services. And that means that often you access the lowest and most average tier of information, which does not do a meaningful amount to convince you sort of the flip side of every argument. But second of all, you like just do not access any information at all. The fourth thing to say is that media algorithms and technology lock people into echo chambers where it's very difficult for them to access information contrary to what they have already been convinced of. But fifthly, often people are locked out of accessing education, which gives them important critical thinking, like the important critical skills that would enable them to, dissect an argument that's made by a politician or made by an article. Like the average person cannot afford years and years of, sort of arts degree, tertiary education. A lot of people don't pursue that kind of education and can't access the sort of ways you are taught to unpick arguments. All of that is to say that it's hard for people to critically evaluate claims. It's hard for people to critically evaluate whether they are aligned with their preferences. And the example that I give is just that an enormous amount of people have been convinced that the voice is something that's really unfair. And I'd note the way that goes against people's intuitions, right? Like the reason that a lot of people are against the voice to parliament is that they perceive it's unfair. Like obviously it would be unfair if there was a body that could control the military with no accountability. That's obviously not how the voice works though. And people do not access the information which explains to them that actually their preference for fairness would be better actualized if the voice existed. Those kinds of things are things that people are able to be convinced of. The third reason why people are bad at actualizing their preferences is that often they have party allegiances. Often people perceive that a particular party is best for them. They do not critically evaluate the claims that party makes, even if they have the ability to. All of that just should suggest to you that people are very bad at actualizing their preferences through voting. Second of all, then, why are people's preferences good, and why is this machine likely to be better at sort of reading them and then distributing policy? A few things to say. The first is we think that the vast majority of people are anti-corruption. They perceive corruption as bad. They think it's unfair, and they are scared of it happening. But often they are unaware of when politicians are sort of funneling corruption into government, and this just means that because there is an information asymmetry there, and currently a lot of corrupt politicians are able to sort of go under the radar. In our world, we think the average preference of every single person to have no corrupt politicians should suggest to you that there is far less corruption on our side, and that's really important. Secondly, though, we think people are fundamentally fairness-oriented. They are fundamentally oriented towards justice, and that means that their preference would create better policy than their vote. And there are a few reasons why people are oriented towards charitability and fairness. First of all, it's one of the first things that you're taught. It's one of the most fundamental things that you're taught as a child, that you should do things that are fair. And we would know that even small children, that's one of their most deeply held beliefs. They say, no, I don't want to do the thing that my mum's telling me because it's unfair. No, I don't want to engage with my sibling in that way because I perceive it to be unfair. It's something that's very deeply held from a young age. Second of all, though, there is rhetoric used by politicians about fairness. Often they obviously use it in ways that are dishonest, but it's something that people associate very closely with politics and care about in that sphere. Thirdly, though, fairness and equality is the foundational teaching of most religions. To the extent that you believe that most people in the world are religious, that's something they care about a lot. But fourthly, we know that the way in which the average person acts shows that they care a lot about fairness. People, as I explained earlier with the example of voice, a huge reason that people, believe bad things, that they are convinced that things are unfair. All of this should suggest to you that people will vote people's intuitions will align with good policies. People will be against things like giving coal and gas subsidies as opposed to welfare. They'll be against things like tax cuts for corporations. They're able to be convinced of those things. The impact of that is just that we get far better policy, which first of all obviously has a meaningful and material impact on people's lives. But second of all, there's a principled impact, right? To the extent that the government has a lot of power over you, it is principally better if that power aligns better with what you think and what you care about, so that you can hold them accountable. Second argument then, we think this creates far more trust. We've noted a few reasons why people currently distrust the system. First of all, they perceive that there is corruption. Obviously, we solve that, particularly in the most low trust context, particularly in contexts in the developing world and in nascent democracies. We think people in those contexts where they know unequivocally that there is no corruption going on, where they know that the person that is in power aligns with their interests, they're more likely to do things like support taxation. They're more likely to pay their taxes. They're more likely to care about government agencies. That's really important. But second of all, often people perceive politicians to be liars, and we obviously fix that as well. And that gives us a series of benefits. Firstly, people engage better with government services, which is really important. But secondly, they don't think that minorities have corrupted the government and treat them badly as a result. People trust the system, they engage with it better. For all those reasons, incredibly proud to affirm.
All good? Cool. This team's case is phenomenologically unusual. They start on a pretty astute observation that there are pretty powerful structures in our society, like the media or private corporations, that have every incentive to influence democracies. They then say, hey, we've got this whiz-bang technology that gets around it. It goes into people's mind palaces and works out the things that they really want and circumvents the influences of those powerful forces. There's a black hole though. They don't answer in that first affirmative speech. What on earth do these powerful social forces do in a world where they are stripped of influences that they currently have? Well, it seems pretty self-evident to me. They'll weaponize the very real fear that people feel about their agency and democratic rights being given to a robot that the government controls, and they'll foment civil unrest. I won't lie. Our claim in this debate is not complicated or multifaceted. It is, in fact, very simple. This will destroy democracy, especially where it is immature and nascent. Let's just get into that first argument. There's going to be possibly a second argument, particularly centering on how it'll be used badly. But let's, for now, have the debate and say it's implemented super well. The technology is exactly as described in the info slide, even in pretty weak states. Why does this cause massive, wide-scale civil unrest? The core of this argument is to explain that we honestly should care about people weigh their own preferences consciously, maybe not for the reason that that outcome is always the most logical one, but because it is an outcome that those people care about. The claim we make is that people perceive this move by the government as profoundly disenfranchising, which just causes them to riot and essentially withdraw from democratic participation in a way that is awful. The first thing to prove here is just why this leads to trust erosion. 3 core things to say here. The first is that there just will be, and Katarina's speech foregrounds this for you, a disjunction between what people's subjective, conscious opinions are about politics, i.e. what party they want to get elected, and what party their stated vote from the robot is going towards and ultimately electing. If you believe that people don't have the intellect or capacity to see why they're voting against their interests, then you definitely ought to believe that it's not necessarily going to make the correct call. People aren't going to make the correct call about whether or not this robot is good for them. They're probably going to see it as an absolute affront to them. Secondly, political parties have, as I foregrounded in the introduction, every incentive to use this to stir up and fund riots. Because basically, if you believe the affirmative case at face value, it is describing why the political right would be disenfranchised systematically by this policy. Because they stand the most to gain, essentially, from corporate capture, from the governments controlled by lobbies, and by medias that don't actually report on genuine corruption. So political parties like the Republican Party in the US, which, let's be charitable to them, let's say it gets systematically disenfranchised by this policy, will now have every incentive in the world to foment civil unrest to make sure that they can obtain political power again. If you believe at all that the political right and its powerful assistants care about fomenting civil unrest, then you surely believe that they'll do this in this debate. Like, it doesn't require very much persuasion. Like, this is an untransparent technology that isn't really easy to see. It's pretty hard to explain to people, like, what's in their mind palace is more important than what they actually think the party they should vote for is. And it's just a scary technology. Like, the Republican Party has been successfully able to convince people that voting machines are something that they should hate. And clearly, this is something they're going to be able to persuade people of. Thirdly, politicians, I think, are going to cease engagement with civic life. Because you only really stand to lose as a politician by engaging heavily with civil life. Because you can make gaps when you're in the public eye, and that only really stands to hurt you. And you stand to be judged on ascriptive characteristics, things you can't control. Like, people will hedge against fucking up in public, and they will just withdraw because they know the democracy bot doesn't care about how people have engaged with, like, how politicians have engaged with the population. It only cares about what people's mind palace says is probably good about that politician. Which means that democracies are now aggressively selecting against politicians with the kind of charisma for nation building, the kind of personalities and presence that would allow them to unite nations, which further contributes to an erosion of trust. So what happens when that trust erodes? We think that you don't really need to believe that trust erosion is that large, but we think it is pretty large to believe that this has enormous consequences. People see democracy as just central to their identity because in democratic states, people become kind of accustomed to it. People think democracy gives them agency. They buy into the idea that if they hand over rights to the government, they get a right back, which is I get the right only myself to decide who I vote for. You are now taking this away. People now essentially think that democracy isn't working with a set of massive consequences. Let's talk about 4 of them. First, I think, and most severely, in the case of nascent democracies, what Kat already described, there is a setting of low trust. This will lead to civil unrest. It will lead to violent, destructive riots that will be directly supported by political parties and cooperation. It will lead to attempted coups and revolutions against government. It will lead people to join and form militias against the government. Yes, maybe this is an extreme harm, but like in the worst cases, this is something that manifests from a lack of trust in democracy. Secondly, this changes people's preferences to want to defund the government and to privatize all services. Because an extension of the argument that people don't trust the government and democracy anymore is they don't think that their tax money is funding good things, that they don't think that their tax money is productive when spent to the government. So their innate preferences that the democracy bot now sees are to create privatized services, are to defund the government, which prices people out of important services, things like healthcare, things like education. Maybe this eventually swings back and people see how bad privatization is because of that pricing people out, because it is less efficient. But I think that constant dislocation where you make people distrust democracy and then make people realize is in itself the harm. Thirdly, people fail to obey laws as they no longer think that they apply to them. They distrust the police because they no longer think that the laws that are set by the government are ones that they consent to because they are things that are controlled by a democracy bot that doesn't actually give them any say. Finally, they distrust government messaging in times of crisis. For instance, they no longer believe that when the government tells them there actually is a health crisis that is happening, that is something that they actually believe in, because they fundamentally distrust the government using this bot. When the government alerts them to crises, they just don't believe it. The weighing of this argument, I think, is just debate wording on the face of it. Like, clearly, this is logically prior to enhancing people's ability to express their preferences in perfect isolation in a democracy, because if democracy is enormously eroded or disappears as a result of implementing this bot, then none of those benefits can really be reaped. And so it's not really a worthwhile outcome that we ought to pursue in this debate. But secondly, I think it super obviously flips the affirmative case when they talk about the circumstances that exist in low trust democracies that have poor media structures, that do have like low trust. I think that absolutely lowers the barrier for those states to fall back into authoritarian backslide, which I think on the face of it wins us this debate. Let's then talk about weak democratic states that will use this badly. Now, this is where we're not going to have the debate as they want us to have it and say, like, you are implementing a technology. Technologies can be changed. They can be altered. You're giving the government a technology that they have the ability to control. There are some nascent democracies in which there are corrupt political parties that at the point they implement this will implement it badly. They will implement the technology with different ways that it modifies its preferences, people's preferences, so that it's more likely that they get in power, which entrenches their power in the long term, because it now becomes super hard for opposition parties to mobilize momentum, because states now have because you can now say, like, this was your actual preference, this measured your brain, rather than, that opposition party simply didn't make persuasive enough arguments. Like, this is weaponized against ethnic minorities to systematically disempower them. This is weaponized to entrench powerful political parties against ethnic minority parties. That seems bad to me. I'm actually proud to negate.
Okay, thank you to our first native speaker, and I will welcome our second affirmative. Sorry.
No, that's totally my bad. This team does not understand the actual problems that plague the people who live in the vast majority of the world. The vast majority of people in the world
do not live in a strong, high-trust democracy. They live in a low-trust, incredibly flawed democracy. A government that struggles to be able to do things like justify its collection of tax, struggles to be able to do things like convince people to vote in governments that will support things like funding tax agencies, like increasing rates of tax to a level that would allow those governments to even function in the first place. The problem here is that when this team talks about the reduction of trust, they fail to understand that for most people in the world, the most vulnerable people in particular, they have no trust in their government under the status quo. This device begins to correct this problem, and I think would be the only real circuit breaker that could correct this problem within the next 5 to 10 years. It would likely lift millions, if not billions, of people out of poverty, give them access to services that they could never before have, give them access to safe and stable states that they could never before have. This is a life-changing technology for the vast majority of the world, and we are going to win this debate in a landslide as a result of it. Firstly on feasibility, then on weak democracies, briefly on strong democracies, and finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about North Korea if I get the time to. So, firstly on feasibility, like the info slide is very, very clear here. It can read your preferences with perfect accuracy. It can select representatives that match those preferences with perfect accuracy, and it is, it's accurate. Like, this is all very, very clear. I don't think it is reasonable for them to suggest that this technology could be co-opted or perverted in any way. The info slide gives no mechanism for that to occur, and I don't think that they actually explain how that could happen, probably because the info slide is deliberately very vague in how this device and technology works, doesn't give them any scope to do so. If these guys could explain the actual mechanism by which corrupt governments could do that, maybe they can get somewhere in this debate, but the info slide literally makes it impossible for them to do so because that is not what the debate is about. Which is why in weak democracies, in the context that we described to you, in places like Rwanda and Senegal, Botswana, Kenya, Nigeria, Venezuela, like Iran, Liberia, all of these are countries that have politicians and elections, but struggle to have a functional state. The fact that they have elections and politicians places them squarely within the scope of this debate. It means that they meet the requirement for this device and technology to operate in those contexts, and in those contexts, there's a cyclical problem, because people understand that their governments are corrupt. They realize that all of the politicians in many of these instances, rightly or wrongly, they certainly perceive them all to be corrupt, which means that the problem then is that the universal preference people have under the status quo in those contexts is they don't want to be taxed in any way, they don't want to fund tax agencies in any way, they don't want any money going to the government, because they're convinced that when money goes to the government, it just gets fleeced from them by officials who live in mansions that people in these countries walk by and see their officials coming in and out of. And that is why the only possible way that you can create a functional state in that context is to restore people's trust and to change that universal preference into one where people are able to say, I want my state to function, I want it to have a reasonable ability to collect taxes, particularly from wealthy people. Note that obviously the overwhelming numerical majority in these contexts is not wealthy, but would likely support things like taxes on multinationals, taxes on the rich to fund that government, and would probably accept a tax on themselves and their neighbors as well to that extent. That is extraordinarily important, because when you have a broken system where nobody is willing to elect a politician who will support an increase in tax, that means that the government is unable to actually justify its existence to their citizens. Because when the governments do not have any money to do anything beyond funding their most basic functions in many instances, they can't do things like embark on new infrastructure projects or embark on new and transformative healthcare or education projects. And those are the projects that we do in the West to justify governments to our citizens and to say why you should fund the tax agencies and why you should pay your taxes, because we'll build you a nice public school that you can send your children to. But these countries lack that capacity because of this broken, vicious cycle. And every time they fail, people become more deeply convinced that the governments are indeed failing them and should not be given money. And that is why they're unable to do this stuff. The problem then is that for this side, they cannot enact a dramatic and clear change that would change that preference of people and make them suddenly trust the government enough to give up their money to it, to believe that other people should do so as well. The only possible way that you could ever change that would be through this device, would be through this technology. Otherwise, they need to rely on claims about state building that are unproven, that have no empirical basis, and that would take place over decades, if not hundreds of years. That's the only mech that this side has. On our side, though, we're able to tap into a deeper universal desire that people have. A universal desire that I think every single person in the world has, and that is that they think corruption is bad, and it is bad when people steal. And I struggle to imagine the person who is sitting in this auditorium or sitting anywhere in the world who is thinking to themselves, no, I think it's good when politicians steal state funds and live in mansions. Like, that person doesn't exist. The one thing that I think everyone in the world agrees upon is that corruption is a bad thing and should not be done. Which is why on our side, the singular guarantee that we can certainly give you is an uncorrupt government in every country in the world that does have a government. And that massively changes the problems of trust that this team describes. Because that is the only world in which people in places where their governments consistently fail them begin to have hope that in fact giving them funding and giving them support will improve their lives and will improve the lives of their children. Think about how dire the status quo is in many of these contexts. A status quo where elections decrease in turnout year on year. A status quo in which we're seeing a real-time decline of democracy in most of the world. A status quo where for most people, they live in contexts with horrible rates of infant mortality, with horrible rates of spreading of diseases that we've eliminated in the West, but we still have not cured in the developing world. A context where people often are not able to have any hope that the government will cause a better future for their children, and that their children will have a better future than they did. Because instead what people see is multinationals plundering their countries. They see people in the West living well off of the wealth that they have extracted from their countries. It is so hard to have hope in this context. This device is the only way forward, and the only way that you would ever be willing to trust in that government again when it has betrayed your trust consistently over the course of generations in the past. That is why we're able to, I think, create a truly monumental change there. Let's deal briefly with strong democracies. The first thing to say here is that I think this team is incredibly doomer in their outlook, but at the same time kind of weirdly not doomer enough. And the first thing I would suggest under this is that politicians in those strong democracies actually probably just don't hate this much. Like, I would suggest that most individual politicians don't really like being part of a party machine, don't really like the infighting and the backstabbing and the politicking and the pre-selection and the machine and trying to court favors from donors, perverting their own ideologies in order to get funding. I would suggest that most politicians probably loathe the fact that they're forced to work within these systems and would prefer not to. And I think for many of these politicians, seeing this device be implemented would be a sense of real freedom for them, would be finally an ability to forgo the donations and the machine and the brand and the politicking and just to get into politics, just to actually convince people of ideology, to meet with communities, to try to change people's minds in a real and deep way. I think most politicians would welcome this device, and for the few that do not, their self-serving interests would be so immediately obvious, their corruption would be so immediately obvious that they would not be able to meaningfully persuade people that this device is wrong without sounding like the corrupt pieces of shit that they probably are. And for the same reason that I've just been able to deliver all that rhetoric, I would suggest that most people would also love this. People love shit like cutting politicians' pay, and they hate when it increases. People love things like being anti-corruption. The reason that Xi Jinping and other authoritarian leaders around the world, like Putin as well, did this, rely on things like saying, I'm the anti-corruption pick, and I'm going to enact a huge anti-corruption policy, and by doing anti-corruption, I'm actually going to purge all of my rivals in the state. Like, the reason that they use the language of anti-corruption is because it is so powerful and so universally loved, which means that on our side, you also get a lack of that corruption in the West, and I think people would realize that that is true and would welcome this machine, would welcome the better policies that it delivers them, but even if it doesn't deliver them better policies, would be incredibly happy to know that their money isn't being stolen, that the state is delivering on preferences, and I think most people just trust technology a lot. Last thing to say here, maybe this ends authoritarianism. I don't know. If you could implement this in a place like Iran, where people really hate the government right now and really are increasingly protesting, maybe you would just end repression there. Maybe if you implemented this in North Korea, people's base desire to have food every day would overturn that government and ensure that they get food every day. Speculative, very high impact though. I don't know, maybe.
Thank you to 7F. I will welcome 7F.
For the record, I do love corruption. It's always funny to read about. All right, starting a speech in 3, 2, 1. Just imagine what it would be like to live in their world. It's a world where every time there's an election cycle, you sit at home and someone gets put into power, and if it's not the person you voted for, it's just tough luck. It's just because you were ignorant. It's just because you don't understand politics. It's a world where people feel like they don't have agency. It's a world where people feel like for all the rights that they trade off to the state on a daily basis, for all the laws that they have to follow that they think are unjust or unfair or arbitrary, are laws that they simply should follow because they were too stupid to figure it out for themselves. I would hate to live in that world. I would feel like I have absolutely no control, and so would all of you. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, why people in nascent democracies will not trust this technology, and it will lead to the worst forms of backsliding that kill millions of people. Secondly, why the structures that they talk about for people don't know their own preferences is worse on their side of the house. And finally, on corruption. So, the biggest push that we get from this affirmative team is that there are some states where people don't have enough trust in democracy for the conditions to actually improve. But these are the sets of states where implementing this technology would be absolutely ridiculous. If people do not trust the government to act responsively, if people do not understand this technology because it is strange and complex and for which they have no oversight, for which the average person simply does not understand, then people will never allow this to be implemented in the first place. And yeah, they can say we will actually put it into power, but the response then is just for every single person in that country to absolutely hate the government because they don't know that the machines are being used correctly. They don't know if people are going in and changing the results and then changing them back. They don't know the highly technical factors that go into machines like this. And that means that they are so skeptical of any of the outcomes that it delivers because it goes against the biggest intuition that these people have, which is that they wanted something. They wanted something to be different from what they got. And that is a world in which people do a number of terrible things. The first thing that happens is just because people don't know their candidates or because people didn't think that they wanted a certain policy, they don't feel like they can trust the government. And as a result, you are just going to get large amounts of insurgency groups and large amounts of rebel groups that now form. This looks like organizations like the Taliban that firstly, forcibly recruit people and fight them and make them fight in their organization under penalty of death. Second of all, it looks like doing things that antagonize the state, even at the cost of the other people within it. That's things like what's going on at Ethiopia in the moment, where rebel and insurgency groups are cutting off medicine and food for people. Children are starving as a result of this, and this conflict was not easy to deal with. It has been going on since last Australs, where I matterfiled for it, and the conditions have not gotten better. The third, I thought it was funny, no one else did. The third thing they do is they literally just kill innocent civilians in order to make an impact, in order to fuck off the government. And they will continue to do this because the harm to them for not doing so is living in a state where they feel like they are being controlled and manipulated and coerced by a government. And this is why throughout history, every single insurgency group has existed. It is because people think if I do not act, then my life is basically forfeit to the whims of arbitrary politicians who are out of touch what I want. And I think that nicely explains why we flip their biggest harm. Because they say once this gets implemented effectively, governments will now start to function better. The claim from the negative team is that this will never be implemented properly, or when it is implemented, it causes so many other extraneous harms that governments just cannot function. And the cost of that is lives. The second issue in this speech, do people know their own preferences? This team's mechanism is, well, there are media structures that influence how you think. There are restrictions to things like access to education, and that means people vote in poor ways. But obviously, those same structures exist on their side of the house. Media corporations and governments still have huge incentives to trick people into believing things because your innate or true desires are just what you fundamentally believe. And obviously you can be tricked on a fundamental level into believing something that you didn't think you wanted. And that means that, first of all, when this happens, it's far, far harder to critique. But it, second of all, explains why politicians have a much greater incentive to just stamp out actually true statements, because this team says things like, well, you'll just know what's true and correct because it exists out in the world, but people currently can't access it. But these are often incredibly complex political arguments. They're arguments that people don't immediately understand, and they take a lot of time in order to understand. People often don't understand them because they default to their more base intuitions about what they've already been told by the media. So now you have governments that never let this get published in the first place, or they say it is undemocratic. They create narratives of nationalism that say this type of information, which may objectively be true and may have objectively altered people's preferences, are against the interests of the state, and they're trying to brainwash you. And that obviously occurs to a larger extent. The second thing that happens, though, is that you just hugely delegitimize any minority political opinion, right? For the exact same reasons. You say things like, well, you lost the election, therefore your actual preference was not what you thought, and you then trick people over time into changing their true desires. Because the distinction that this team fails to engage with is what we believe is entirely socially constructed. The reason that any of us think anything in this room is because we've grown up around parents, because we've read and been exposed to literature in school, and when governments have the strongest political incentive in the world and no culpability to just say, well, you were an idiot, then obviously people change their true or innate desires, right? That deals with all of that material. The final thing I want to talk about is on trust. They say, well, politicians are currently corrupt, and this fixes that problem, but obviously, an elected politician can still engage in corruption, and now we've demonstrated why there's far less oversight. And I would note, Jordyn says, and admittedly, maybe we didn't mech all of it, that was a fair point, but there are pretty easy ways to tamper with technology, right? I don't know how many of you do computer science, but all technology is a series of code lines. It's very easy to go in, change the code line very dramatically so it weighs things slightly differently, and then the outcome of the election is different. It's a process that can be kept incredibly secretive because there aren't voting records of what people express their preference for. It is a system that tells people that you should just trust the state will do it well. And that provides them, first of all, with the inability to be regulated, the inability for anti-corruption committees to exist and have evidence that the state is doing something wrong, and as a result, every incentive to engage in corruption as much as possible. At the end of this speech, you should believe that even in nascent democracies where this might have helped improve trust, it never got implemented. And in the majority of democracies where it was relatively stable, there was now a tendency towards those more unstable democracies because people could not trust the government, because people felt like they had no agency, because people ceded every right under the sun with the expectation that they would get a say, and now they're told that their say is meaningless, it is worthwhile, and you just have to sit there and take it. Clear neg win.
Thank you, Julian. I will welcome her up.
Most of Negative's case is contingent on believing that people's level of trust in this system will be so low that an insurgency will be created. But that is so unbelievably unlikely because we've had many changes to our voting system. Note electronic voting machines, note automatic voting counting, note giving women the vote, and those things did not trigger these massive violent uprisings that this Negative team hangs their hat on. It is unclear to me why this specific thing is the tipping point that creates a political coup or creates something as extreme as defunding the government. I think that's incredibly unlikely. But even if you don't buy that, the government obviously has vested incentives in educating people to the absolute maximum level as possible in what this machine would look like. This is entirely analogous to the distrust and disfaith people have in the current system. No one can watch while people scrutiny the votes. No one can watch while every ballot is counted by hand. No one can watch while the machine is regulated. You just have a trust in your government that the voting process happens in a way that is at least somewhat moral, and we think this would also stand in this world. 3 things in response. Firstly, on people's faith in democracy, secondly, on coups and riots, and finally, on people's trust in their own government. Firstly, let's start with their faith in democracy. 2 pushes from side negative. The first is on erosion of trust, and the second is on the media. Firstly, on erosion of trust. Because what we hear from first is that people will become so disenfranchised by this system, and it will be an affront to everything they believe, given that people value democracy highly. And I think that last observation is astute, because people do value democracy highly, but the problem in the status quo is they don't feel like it's being fulfilled, because they feel like the way that they vote is, 1, not really count, it doesn't really count to anything, but 2, is manipulated by so many other factors like familial pressures and like media that thing isn't fulfilled. But let's respond with 4 actual reasons as to why people are disenfranchised in the status quo. 1, most of the time, governments do not follow through with the promises they make during an election, so people feel disenfranchised by the fact that the thing that they voted for never comes to fruition. Second of all, they often think that their individual vote doesn't mean anything, so in a lot of places they never go out to the voting booths in the first place because they think that they're just a number. Thirdly, people find it incredibly difficult to see through high-level propaganda and high-level political media, which means that they are disenfranchised because they don't really understand what they're voting for. But finally, the voting process in and of itself is disenfranchising. Note the fact that the time and place where elections in the US occur, the fact that a lot of people, for them, they think the government is intentionally making it hard for them to get out to the voting booth, to do things like take time off work and travel there, and a lot of people, that locks them out of voting in the first place. Secondly, let's talk about the media, because the push that we just hear from Ben is that the media would exist under both sides and that the media would be able to do things like change your fundamental beliefs. The first observation I would make here is that the media's ability to change your fundamental and core moral beliefs is relatively limited. In that, the media has an incentive to do things like clickbait style articles and go for the lowest hanging fruit, which means the amount of volume of media it would have to do to change your deep-seated beliefs is quite high and unlikely. But even if you don't buy that, it doesn't matter if some parts of your perspective are changed. For example, if you get convinced that like some, business thing is good or some small tax thing is good, people's deep care about things like integrity and stability and corruption are extremely difficult for media outlets to change because those things are inherent within people. They're things that everyone almost universally agrees to be good, and it is unclear why the media would have an incentive to convince people that corruption is good or an incentive to convince people that destabilizing the government is good. But finally, we think that, as I've already mentioned, the opportunity cost of the media focusing on those deep level things is obviously not worth it. So, at the end of that argument, it's clear that people's faith in democracy is already incredibly weak, and this unique mechanism allows us to actually increase people's faith. But I want to explain that more in this next argument, which is about coups and riots, because then there are 3 pushes from side negative. The first is about civil unrest, the second is about defunding the government, and the third is about people disobeying laws. Firstly, on civil unrest, 2 responses. 1, in strong democracies, people love stability, so it's unclear to me why civil unrest would be created in a place like America or Australia or the UK, because people like having a stable home, they like having a stable government, they like being assured that things are going to be the same the next day as they were today. So it's incredibly unclear to me why people would have an incentive to change the system. But even governments themselves, under the status quo, they lose elections. That doesn't mean that they want to cause civil unrest and instability. Maybe they're a bit pissed off, and maybe once in every literal millennia we have January 6th, but that is obviously incredibly rare. But secondly, in weak democracies, we think that the democracy is already so weak and civil unrest is already often so high that this new mechanism actually gives people a unique ability to think that the government is representing them. And that's because they finally can actually have their vote mean something, because they are no longer clouded by the political rhetoric around this person is anti-corrupt when they're actually not anti-corrupt. Because if you truly believe in anti-corruption, you will get the best of maybe bad options, but at least the best option that represents anti-corruption. And that is something you would never be able to get under the status quo, because you may not even know that that person exists, and the ability for that person to campaign is incredibly difficult. But second of all, I think Ben's, 3 minutes of Ben's speech is just fucking bizarre to me, because people already have so much distrust in the voting system and in the voting booths, but we let it happen anyway, and people don't just uprise for no reason. They can't be bothered. It is just so unclear to me as to why this is the tipping point. Second of all though, let's talk about defunding the government and disobeying laws. 1, People obviously disobey laws in the status quo. This isn't the tipping point. Secondly, on defunding the government, I think this is contingent on believing that people's distrust in the machine is so much more than their distrust in the status quo, and I don't think they give us enough reasons to believe that. Thirdly, though, numerically, the volume of people that would support things that cause defunding the government is quite small, because defunding the government automatically means not getting things like welfare payments, and the amount of people that would be pro that is very, very limited. Very few people are in the top 1%. Maybe the top 1% wants to defund the government. Unclear why the bottom 99 has an incentive. Finally, on the Ethiopia wildcard example, fuck me. Like, seriously? That's obviously the minority, the minutiae of examples. Most recognized democracies do not ascend into this kind of chaos because their institutions are well grounded enough and well supported by other parallel institutions and other economies that support them that it is unbelievably unclear why that is likely. Finally, let's talk about the trust in the government, because Affirmative says that now people are going to have no hope because they think that their role in society is virtually rendered into nothing and everything is so unfair. However, this is so unresponsive to Jordyn and Kat, who tell you that now people have faith that they themselves can actually do something to change the government and change society. And that's because you no longer have to, spend all your time campaigning to politicians, explaining why your views matter and why you want their policies to reflect you. Instead, you can just campaign to people in your community and family to care about things like anti-corruption, because if you all care about that thing, ultimately that will be reflected in the vote. You no longer have to campaign to the politicians because they just inherently are going to care about the same things. And if you're on the same moral pipeline, the benefits to you as an individual are probably pretty high. So, what you should believe at the end of this debate. Firstly, all of their stuff about descending into chaos is taken out of this debate because in the places where that is likely to happen, the distrust they already have in the government is so much more than the distrust they would have in this system, which is relatively sound given the level of technology. But second of all, in Western liberal democracies, there are other structures and institutions in place that mean that the chances of this occurring are so low, they are literally the only damages they can bring in this debate. They must lose.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll welcome the next to close out the substantive portion of our debate. I'm really not bothered. Should we use that audio? I think Arnie's just concerned you won't be in the visual proofread.
Oh, right.
I
But-
can
so
look
they-
at
I forgot everyone was speaking from there.
No, but
No
I
worries.
think if you want
Yeah.
to speak from there.
Yeah, that'd be good. If I could just put it right.
Yeah. I'm not doing it.
You'll be able to hear me even if you can't see me on the recording.
I think we will be able to see you.
Take this team at their best and consider the context where they think they're doing the best in this debate. Countries where you have very little trust in the government that exists right now, countries where you think your government is broadly dysfunctional. In those contexts, this affirmative team expects those governments to somehow convince people who are probably less educated than people in Western states given less access to education, people who have less understanding of technology and very technology that this government would rely on, and whose capacity to do messaging is very low. This affirmative team would expect those governments to convince the people in those countries that this truly insane system in which they have no tangible way of ensuring that their vote is actually being counted and their interests are actually being met, that system is functional. I think clearly in those contexts are the instances where you have the least capacity to set up the system well and ensure that it works, and that is the point where you get these countries tipped from being dysfunctional democracies into instances where you have civil war, where you have total dysfunction of government, where you have people, hundreds of thousands of people dying on a regular basis. Clearly we win this debate by a huge margin. First issue, which side gets more trust in government? Second, which side gets better policies? Firstly then, on trust in government. The first question I'm going to ask is, to what extent do people trust the system as it exists right now? The first claim here is that there's lots of corruption, so people rarely ever trust their government or be willing to fund government services, even in the status quo. I think the first response to this is just that, as we explained to you at Diskin, corrupt politicians probably exist on either side, in that even politicians that are fairly elected and have good policy platforms that reflect the interests and the desires of voters can still do things like embezzle funds, which means they don't actually get any less corruption on their side. But secondly, in many cases, people are just not aware of this corruption, meaning corruption often isn't the biggest driving force in why people don't like their government. People don't like their government because it doesn't provide functioning services, because it isn't doing a very good job, because they don't actually believe that those politicians are competent, not just because of reasons like corruption. Their second explanation then is to say that politicians will be seen as liars now. First response to this is that there's clearly incentives on both sides to continue to lie. Politicians want to be seen positively by the general public for many other reasons than just getting re-elected. That's for things like being able to attract more sponsors. That's for things like getting jobs after they leave office. That's because people just care about their public interest. But secondly, at best, I think this is super marginal, because in the instances where you have truly dysfunctional democracies, or even in countries where democracy just isn't that strong, it's not lying that makes you dislike politicians, it's the fact that they are not providing the things that you need. Second sub-question of this clash then is, how will this change the amount that people trust in their governments? Their response to Jordyn that they bring up again at Bella is that most of the world lives in places where there is very low trust in government right now, so things realistically can't get that much. But I would note firstly that actually in these countries and in these contexts, that's where you have the most capacity for things to get worse. Because this is the tipping point that legitimizes things like rebel groups that already have some level of power in these contexts. It's the thing that sparks civil war. It's the thing that leads to the final collapse of these governments. Because consider a country that currently has a weak democracy, and suddenly that government that people already don't trust says, hey guys, I've just invented this magic machine that reads your mind and is going to find your inner desire and elect the correct person. Nobody in that country, if they already have low trust in that government, is going to believe that that machine is functional and will actually do the job that it's supposed to do, which explains to you why in these contexts you do get tipped into civil war, you do get tipped into the worst kinds of harms in this debate. But second response to this, I would just note that in these instances where governments are dysfunctional, politicians often aren't the thing that tears those countries apart. They're the things that unite that country together, because a strong, powerful, charismatic leader is what creates trust in government, not a fucking robot that you can't even talk to. People like Nelson Mandela in Africa, South Africa, people like BJP in India, people like Lula da Silva in Brazil are the people, the faces that you can tangibly see in front of you that unite them. This team would not elect these people because things like charisma are just tricks that the media plays on you to convince you to voting for silly people. I think actually their charisma is what makes them the most important people to be elected in this context, because they unite people around governments and give them the capacity to begin to function. The third response to this is that just simply in these contexts, there is no capacity to build trust in these machines, because maybe they already don't trust things like voting, but voting is something that at least is physical. At least you can understand the way that you count the number of votes that were elected and the person with the most vote gets elected. But this system is just truly impossible to conceptualize of or understand. It is entirely a black box that people cannot see inside of, and this opposition team would expect you to believe that these contexts with governments that are fairly dysfunctional and that people don't have much trust in could convince the general public that that was going to work. I think that is simply untrue. And at that point, you should believe that in these contexts, where there is the most risk of collapse and the most risk of government dysfunction, massive harms accrue at the instance at which you implement this policy. The second claim they make then is actually trust goes up, because now you don't believe that there's any corruption in your country and you have way more trust in the politicians that are elected. But I think surely the opposite is true, because even if factually the amount of corruption goes down, the perceived amount of corruption goes up, because previously people could tangibly see that they casted a vote, and at the very least in their mind, that vote reflected their interests. Now, who knows how that decision was made? Who knows if someone could tweak it? Even if in the info slide it tells you that these things couldn't be tweaked or that code couldn't be tampered with, people obviously will believe that that code has been tampered with and that something has been done by those politicians, which means that people actually believe that there is more capacity for corruption. They tell you at Bella that people also have blind trust in voting machines because you aren't in the room when that vote is being counted. But there are firstly mechanisms that exist to get around around that. For example, the fact that we have different institutions in charge of counting votes than who are part of the government, which means that people have more trust in the way that that voting is done. But secondly, I think just when elections are unfair in the status quo, you at the very least have evidence of that corruption. You can show that those voting machines were tampered with. You can show that there was not correct oversight of those votes. You can have whistleblowers that say, yes, this government participated in the tampering of these elections, which means you get called out when those instances of unfair elections happen and actual accountability occurs, rebuilding that trust in those voting systems even where it fails. The alternative in this system is you have none of those mechanisms because, as I said before, this voting mechanism is entirely a black box that people have no capacity to understand. But the second response to this is just that there are clearly way more emotive and powerful reasons to distrust your government than corruption. And that is all of the mechanisms we give you that are almost entirely unresponded to. It's firstly that definitionally, as per for any of their benefits around policy to accrue, the person who is elected, at least in some instances, is going to be different to the person who these people thought they wanted to be elected, which means they are going to think that this is incorrect because people innately trust their own preferences. Even if they have been tricked, they don't believe they've been tricked, which means they when a different politician is elected, they think that something has gone wrong. But secondly, because politicians themselves stir up this trust and say that the system is unfair when they aren't elected, they say their corruption will be obvious and that these people would immediately be kicked out of politics. But I just think this is categorically untrue. If you're a politician who was unelected in an election you thought was unfair, I think it's probably true that people would see that as a righteous fight against a system which is unfair, against a random machine that some government some time ago decided that needed to be implemented, that reads your mind and works by magic. But third mechanism we give you is just that the leaders who are the most charismatic, the most capacity to unite nations, don't get elected because their policy platform was maybe imperfect. They do get elected on our side and are far better. Their response to this then, Isabella, is to say that, well, we've had big changes before and these did not cause this massive distrust in government. Firstly, intuition check this. This is a massive difference compared to any of those things. It's something that's way harder to conceptualize of and understand. Your belief that a woman could have the capacity to vote is a fairly intuitive claim that most people believe in. Your belief in the capacity that a machine can read your mind, understand your preferences perfectly, and then categorize that into a maximally representative elected official is far harder. But secondly, just not all parts of politics have the incentive to create this trust, because even if some parts of the government are trying to signal to the population that you ought to believe in this machine, other parts, for the reasons we explained to you, are actively fighting against this. I won't even get into the next class because it's clearly so much less important than any of this. Firstly, because of the war and protest that literally kills people. Secondly, because of the government services that get massively defunded as a result of this. And thirdly, because they're failing to disperse government messaging, things like health orders which save people's lives. For all of these reasons, very proud to negate.
For every successful affirmative push that happens in this debate, they must accrue an inherent harm which will cost them the win. For every time there is a deviation from what someone believes they think, from the way that the robot reads the mind palace and assesses it, that is one more person who is deeply angry at a state that they feel does not represent them. For each unit of non-representation that a bought-out media garners, for each conservative party that is just destroyed from a state in which this is implemented, is another, once again, institution that has all the means and all the motive to want to weaponize it against the very institutions of democracy itself. For each person who now fears the state as a fundamental part of who they are is another person who now will vote via the machine to engage in privatization and the removal of the state. This was because the technology was fundamentally different to any other change that had occurred in democracies. As we tell you at Charlie, this was not like voting for women. This was not like counting electronically, because it wasn't something that people mostly had buy-in for, and the very in essence of what it wasn't something that was changing how people vote, but whether people could vote themselves. That was stripping autonomy from people. That was making people feeling like they had absolutely no say in any of the rights they gave up to the state and any of those implications for them. And the impact of this debate was absolutely astronomical and debate-winning. That is because you must believe that for every Republican Party that can get all that fluff about the way that electoral votes are counted by a machine will get even more of a stress about the way in which they want to remove the Republican Party's existence because a large amount of their voter base is, for example, working class people. That looks like coups. It looks like revolutions. It looks like the formation of militias. And as Ben astutely observes, these are kind of like revolutions that will hit the populace the hardest, will result in bodies of average people being thrown to the ground, resulting in worse healthcare and worse access to food and water. And these weren't just small cases. These were likely to be a large amount of the world, as we proved to you. But even if you believe that it's only likely to be a couple cases where this is strong enough, that was likely to be particularly bad. Because these are people who, it wasn't a limitation on democracy, it was no democracy at all. And that trade-off meant the harms, like things like genocides, things like absolute destruction of the rights of people in general occurred as opposed to a slight imposition of that. That was debate winning. It didn't matter if there was already some distrust. The fact that most people in this room don't think technology could vote for them probably, don't like a world where they never get to vote, they don't even know the name of the politician they're voting for because there is no need for that politician to ever step in the limelight, was a world in which people were going to be incredibly fucking angry. And even if you didn't believe they would revolt, they would hate everything else the state does. Why would they follow laws? Why would they listen to police? Why would they listen to state messaging when a health crisis happened? Nothing the state did was perceived to be important or a reflection of them. They would hate it. So, even if you don't believe that push, we tell you that we win on our own metrics. That is to say, things like corruption in nascent democracies or weak democracies or even authoritarian states that try and throw in this debate mean that technology can be implemented in a particularly bad way. Because code can be changed, the communication of implications of our results can be changed. And even if it wasn't weaponized in a very explicit way, at least it was perceived to be. At the very least, you lose the ability for politicians, for example, people being able to unite countries to ever eventuate because there is no need for them to ever enter the limelight in the first place. I think this is an incredibly clear win for side negative. Because not only must you believe that the chance of coups, the chance of revolutions, and the chance of militias to form is likely, but it's also likely to happen in incredibly vulnerable states that Affirmative stakes their case on. I have truly never been prouder to negate because I myself don't want a world where I don't vote and I trust the robot to search my brain to get there. Never been prouder. Woo!
Much like the corrupt politicians the negative stakes their case on, they want to scare you into thinking that this tech is a chatbot that will be corrupted by the government. When they come out at first and they tell you that corruption is terrible and this will lead to wars, and put on their helmets and blast off into space, you should not be scared by the things they tell you because frankly, they're not true. They tell you that the feasibility of the device will never happen because it's going to get co-opted by the government and so they will always get elected and the government says it's undemocratic and so it will instill fear in them. But the first thing to say is it is literally in the info slide that we can assume feasibility of this device. I think it is silly that so much of the debate has rested on this. But the second thing to say here is even if it works badly, it is unlikely that this would happen in functioning democracies, which means would only happen in developing countries with nascent democracies, which, spoiler alert, corruption already fucking occurs here and it's already pretty bad and people are already disenfranchised by the government. It is super unclear why that gets far, far worse in this debate. Two ways we win. Firstly, on more representative politicians, and secondly, we co-opt all of the next material about getting better democracy by telling you we just get far more trust in the government. But what do we tell you about the representation of politicians and how we just get far more representative ones? The first thing we say is that people on net have good intuitions, and what happens under the status quo is that they are influenced by external factors that change their voting patterns. These are things like media capture and things like coercion from other politicians who tell them to believe things are true, but they aren't necessarily. It looks like things like lack of access to information, which means the external influences change the way that people vote, which means they're not best representing their own desires. That is obviously quite harmful. The second thing we tell you though is onto our world, politicians just unable to do things like inflate their character for you to believe certain things about them. It means the device is quite literally reading what their innate desires at the same time as it reads yours, which means obviously you're going to be accurately matched with someone. The third thing we tell you though is you lose things like party loyalty, where people blindly bestow faith in the party that they have history with. This is particularly important when party policies do things like change over time and people don't have an awareness of the way that party is changing and the way its rhetoric is moving. It means that it can pair you with a party that is better representative of your interests. Charlie tells you that no one's going to understand this technology, but negative never considers the fact that an election could just go well. Like, maybe a politician gets voted in that hasn't been voted in before because it is representative of people's desires, and they actually feel super fucking represented by their government, and it could be a good thing. You cannot take a shitty characterization of this topic that relies on a feasibility mechanism and tell them that they can run with it and win. That is stupid. The third thing here, though, is that we co-opt all of their material about democracy when we tell you things like in the status quo, people are already disenfranchised by corruption. They're already scared of false promises or people's failure to live up to their values. But the second thing we tell you is the existing corruption exists through things like gerrymandering and pools of fraud. At worst, we are symmetric with them. But at best, people are just more likely to trust a non-politically affiliated device, right? But what do they say? They tell you things like corruption is always going to exist because good politicians can also be bad, but they may have the capacity to be bad, but I'm not quite sure why they have the incentive to do things like this. But it's also just true that on the next stuff, the developing world's contingent that all politicians are corrupt in the developing world. That is just untrue, right? Maybe there are really bad politicians that exist. However, it is far less likely they get voted in. The reason good politicians don't get voted in the status quo is because there's no advertising or media of them, and they just don't have the ability to do things like prop their image in the same way that more corrupt ones with better accesses to funds and resources do, right? The final thing they tell you here is just people are going to feel disenfranchised because they can't opt into politics now. But that's just silly, right? Because obviously you can still have opinions, and obviously voters who are already really engaged in politics are going to have their interests well represented through this system. Obviously you can do things like still represent a political candidate. You cannot believe that characterization from the negative team. But at the end of this, even if you don't believe all of that material, you all believe the stuff that we tell you about the fact that this device on net has the possibility and the potential to provide good outcomes. In a status quo that is already fucked up, we ought to do something at least to change it and improve it and restore some level of faith in democracy.